If we want to find solutions to today's challenges and build bridges across divides, we need a deeper understanding of global issues. The Pulitzer Center supports journalists all over the world who report on topics like climate change, public health, migration, and more. We share that reporting through public events that engage wide audiences and lesson plans that inspire the next generation. Support journalism and education for the public good. Become a Pulitzer Center champion today.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to In Conversation with Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr. This is day one of Environment Redefined, the 2021 Pulitzer Center Conference. I am Leilani from the Pulitzer Center. As our audience settles in, please let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. I am joining from Cherokee and Muskogee Creek land, now known as Atlanta, Georgia. So while you share, let me know if you can't hear me. So for those who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with a mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our staff and our work are global. Hi, Ayana, my mom's from Muskegon. Sorry. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world on topics including environment, but also racial justice, migration, public health, and more. And we don't stop with reporting. Our education programming spans from elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. Environment Redefined is the Pulitzer Center's 4th annual conference. In past years, we've explored topics of gender, peace and conflict, and religion. Last year, in lieu of a conference canceled because of the pandemic, we hosted an online series focused on justice issues. We're so glad that you're joining us this year for our first ever virtual conference. And if you're inspired by what you hear today, please consider supporting our vital mission. So just a couple of logistics before we get started. We'll begin with a little conversation, then aim to answer questions from the audience. So you can add your questions anytime via the Q&A icon. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us, just let us know via the chat box. And we are recording this session to post online. We're also live tweeting, and you can join that conversation with the hashtag #EnvironmentRedefined. And one final note, please stay online once this session ends to participate in a brief survey. Now, the fun part. I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker. Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr. is the president and founder of the Hop Caucus, a minister, a community activist, a US Air Force veteran, and one of the most influential people in hip hop political life. In 2018, he helped launch Think 100%, Hip Hop Caucus's award-winning climate communications and activism platform. Thank you all for being here. And welcome, Reverend Yearwood.
It's so good to see you. So good to be with you and the Pulitzer Center. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, is there anything that you'd like to add in way of introducing yourself?
I think the most important thing is that I am here, which is amazing. It's a busy, busy time, but I'm also, as you mentioned, president and founder of Hip Hop Caucus, and I'm originally from Louisiana, and that has a huge impact on the work that I do in regards to climate and environmental justice. But I'm just here fighting for humanity, and just so glad to be with you and with all the other amazing journalists who are so important to this work.
Thank you. Well, one thing that I do know about your background is that you were mentored by the legendary Dr. Dorothy Irene Height. Can you tell us a little bit more about her and about any lessons that she gave you that you apply today in your climate work?
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing her up. Dr. Dorothy Irene Height was amazing. She was a civil rights activist. She was an educator. She was the president of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, incorporated one of the largest African American sororities in the world. She was the creator and founder of the National Council of Negro Women. And it was amazing for me because I think that I'm not sure why she liked me, why she decided to mentor me, but maybe because I had a bunch of red hair. I'm not sure. That could be a lot of it. But I think, but she was just phenomenal, and she taught us many things. One of the things she taught us, her building is the only building on Pennsylvania Avenue when you actually take the inauguration route from the Capitol to the White House. Her building on Pennsylvania Avenue is the only building that is owned by a Black person on Pennsylvania Avenue. And that was important to her. And that was one of the first things she taught us, was the need to have strong institutions. So one thing I learned from her was something that it wasn't really about individuals, but about institutions. And to fight institutionalized and systemic racism or other problems, you have to have strong institutions. The other thing I learned from her was just the power of Black women. She was just phenomenal. Obviously, she just believed in that. But she also was just amazing because, me being close to her, I learned so much because when the March on Washington, obviously she was not just a peer, she actually was older to understand the time when the March on Washington was happening with John Lewis and Dr. King and all of them. They didn't have any women speaking. And even though she was one of the groups that was a sponsor of the March on Washington in '63, she was in a position where they didn't really have any women speaking. They had women singing, not really speaking. And so she was actually could have been Dr. King or John Lewis's mother. And that was a slight, but she never got angry because of that. She would joke with me later on. She just said she outlived them all, so that she could be. So she was still around. And all them young folks was gone, and I'm still here. And she had an influence, and she literally looked upon her 80s and even her 90s as her moment. It was amazing. So it was almost like she felt like she was preserved for that. I think the last thing that I would say was that she would say that if the time is not ripe, you have to ripen the time. And that's one thing that I think that I have tried to do, because the issue of racial justice and climate justice really wasn't at the forefront when I was talking about it. Now 10 years ago when I was bringing it up. And it was obviously a part of the conversation, and environmental justice was a part of the conversation, but that was the point there. We had to ripen the time. We had to bring it into the conversation. So today, when we're talking about environmental justice now at the forefront, and President Biden is a part of his plan, and we have the Green New Deal, it's amazing that we have ripened the time. And so I'm excited about that. And all that came from the great wisdom of Dr. Dorothy Height. May she rest in power. She passed away 11 years ago today.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. As it is the anniversary of her passing, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about climate justice for those on the other side of the Jordan. So what I mean by that is climate justice for those who have passed. What does that look like? And I think one of the ways that takes shape is I'm Indigenous to the Pacific, and we are experiencing loss of our grave sites due to both rising sea levels and military expansion and construction. I understand that that's an issue that you have testified with the Bethesda African Historical Cemeteries Coalition. you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And definitely, I understand. And I wanted to say that I reach out to you virtually here in solidarity. It is for many people who may not understand the importance of their ancestors. We just discussed for me Dr. Dorothy Irene Height and what she meant to me, but she is now an ancestor. And in the struggle, particularly for Indigenous and Black and Brown and Red people, the way that we actually continue to fight many times is simply because we're carrying the mantle of our ancestors. And so we want to honor them, obviously, where they're resting, and protect that, because then we can take the next generation to see them and be a part of them. So there are many cases in which through climate disaster and climate crisis, that if their resting place is being disturbed. One is obviously just from the aspect of the climate crisis. As I mentioned, I'm originally from Louisiana. And so because of sea level rise, and the way that if you've ever been to New Orleans, the cemeteries are a little different. They actually sit on top. They're not like sometimes below. And so literally when Katrina hit, a lot of times the caskets were unwashed. And they were literally they were in the water with the people. When people were literally wading in the water after Hurricane Katrina, the caskets were right there with them as well. It was horrific, but that's also one of the immediate aspects of the climate crisis. The other aspect of people not able to rest peacefully, as we saw within Standing Rock or in your community, we're seeing that people digging up the ground to create the extractive measures, either through the pipeline process or to trying to put other means that are part of the extractive process down. So that's disturbing, and that's disturbing, period, because of what it's causing to the people. But the other part to that is the part where those who are in the struggle and they're dying because of the weight. So for me, I want to bring up, actually, there's an amazing brother who died last year named Cecil Corbin Mark, who was at WEAC for Justice, which is a great EJ organization in Harlem, New York. And he passed last year, and many people are passing because of just the weight of the movement that is upon them as well. They're dying or they're being killed in many cases. So I think that as we are looking at this process, we have to look at what it means to not only the living, but to the dead as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's an aspect of environmental racism to it as well, because these disturbances occur in tribal communities, in indigenous communities, in places like Turkey Creek, Mississippi, which is a community of freedmen, for those who don't know. That's also an Agent Orange dumping site. It's felt disproportionately in communities who have already experienced marginalization.
Most definitely. I mean, well, let me just say this very clearly. I don't mind one day becoming an ancestor. That will happen to all of us, but I don't want to become that too soon. And that's why I'm fighting for clean air and clean water. And if I stop this climate crisis, because I don't want to become an ancestor too soon. I want to let that process be what it's going to be. And so I think that you're right. And that's what we're fighting. Too many times through environmental racism, people are creating the landfills and the refineries and the pollution that is killing us all. And that is something that we have to deal with. And we're done dying, to be honest. I think that one of this new environmental movement that we are embarking on, I love the title of this discussion, is to redefine this whole environmentalism in the environment, because we have to. I think that to be honest, we got it. The environmental movement got it wrong in some cases. When the environmental movement was created, 50 years ago, that the modern day environmental movement, meaning kind of coinciding with the Earth Day, and also coincided with the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the creation of the Department of Energy, which was around 77, which was around the time of the crisis we were dealing with in regards to the oil crisis at that time, the creation of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. All these things were created at the beginning of the 70s, and obviously, as well as a lot of our environmental organizations were also created. Greenpeace, LCV, League of Conservation Voters, NRDC, all of them are created between this window of between 1968 and 72. I bring that up because I think that creation then begins to silo out one of the key aspects of justice in this conversation. And so we went along for 50 years, in essence, not having justice as a core tenet of the environmental conversation. And so now we're coming back to that. And I think that we're realizing that, wow, we lost 50 some odd years of not having that part of the conversation. And now we're moving forward to really reclaim that, because we have to, because we're dying and we're done dying. And so now justice has to be at the center of the conversation.
And you know, you bring that up, and that's one of those unseen forms, in my view, of environmental racism, is who gets to be viewed as an environmentalist. I think that perhaps a lot of Black and Indigenous and Brown folks are fighting for clean air, clean water, clean safe environments, but don't get considered environmentalists the same way that other environmentalists do.
Well, I mean, and that's part of the problem. You know, I think that that has to change, and we're changing that. And the reality is that a lot of times the environmental conversation and even the conservation conversation was almost like passing down one's golf clubs, in which you was like a part of the country club. And you would pass down something to be a part of. We would go to the woods and we'll check out the trees. All very important things, but it was disconnected from the realities of what we were dealing with. I think that now, as we are now dealing with the crisis, and we realize from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that, as my hat says, it was 12 years. Now we only have 9 years remaining, and time is ticking. That we don't have time for that kind of just lofty. And that's why I think that journalists too are now re-looking at how they're reporting on the climate crisis. They're not so much, I mean, I'm seeing that more. They're now saying that, yes, we need to discuss what's happening with the polar bears and the ice caps. And we definitely need to discuss greenhouse gases, but we have to also discuss the day-to-day destruction of what the crisis is doing, even down to what our grid. So we saw what we saw in Texas. We have to discuss all of these things from a different lens. And I'm excited about that, because that is part of where we are. I'm excited because I've been beating that drum for a long time to tell this story differently. So I'm excited. Journalists are now saying that if we're not telling this conversation, and when I talk about this crisis through a lens of justice, then honestly, we're not really having an adequate and truthful conversation.
Heard. On that note, are there suggestions or strategies that you have for all the journalists on this call for how they could be telling fuller or more honest stories about the climate crisis and the environment?
Well, it's going to be difficult in some aspects, and I'll be honest, because you have to almost recalibrate yourself, right? That's real, right? You have to recalibrate how you see something, because if you've been told that this is environmentalism, this is how the climate crisis should be discussed, like around, you know, it's about planting trees or about this, then you have to then recalibrate. Well, hold on, now I'm understanding now that this is much more detail that there are literally crimes that are taking place. There are crimes against humanity. There are crimes against people. There are people who are literally sitting around in boardrooms who are trying to hurt people. But I think they are the path of least resistance, or creating sacrifice zones in which they can just do what they want to do. And people are now re-looking at that. And I think that's a very different lens. And you have to just re-look at it. And also, because the movement right now is going through a structure. You know, I'm very proud to be on the board of a group called Green 2.0, which is actually holding a lot of the larger climate organizations accountable about literally who's on their staff and who's working for them, and just to change the makeup so that people can see it as a crisis, but also something that should be solved by all of us: Black, white, brown, red, male, female, straight, gay, theists, atheists, humans fighting for this movement. I think that's what journalists now have to look at. So one, to recalibrate. Two, I think without a doubt, if justice is not part of your climate story, you don't have a climate story. If you're not looking from the justice perspective, then you're wrong in that aspect. So that's the second thing. And then the last thing is that I think, frankly, just looking for different people. I mean, I think that there are many people who are from Black and brown and indigenous, not as the people who are suffering. That's important too as well, but also as the experts. I think there's something within that that's missing, that's happening. I'm so proud of, folks, who are now rising up on all levels, people of color, and people are now telling their story. They have to, because people are not going to be quiet anymore.
True. Well, I think that we could actually talk about a case study, and that is Hurricane Katrina, and your work with the Gulf Coast Renewal Project. Now, this work is super important to me. You said you're from Louisiana, and I grew up in Miami. I also see my little sister is on, so half a day, sissy. She was 2 years old when Katrina hit. I was 8. And I have very vivid memories of holding her while our windows were shaking. And I also have a memory of seeing you with about a decade off of you, yelling power to the people. Could you tell me more about why that was such a groundswell moment?
Yeah, and actually, thank you for bringing that up. First of all, thank you. You definitely made me feel very old, but that's okay. Yes, all right.
Me too.
No, that's okay. I am that. That's okay. Like I said, I don't want to be an ancestor too soon. So that's all part of the process. So I think that people forget that on August 25th, that the Hurricane Katrina went through Florida. Actually, people forget about that. We know how it hits New Orleans on August 28th and 29th, but literally 4 days before, it cut through Florida. It had tremendous impact. So thank you and I actually took lives. And actually, so thank you that's actually very important. People forget about how, just the path of that, because it had so much destruction in the Gulf Coast. But it was traumatic. It still is traumatic for me. I was actually not in my home state when it hit. I actually was in Washington, D.C., the Piscataway Nation, and we're in the District, Maryland, Virginia area. And I was there when it was going through. And it was actually, I think it was terrible, because I literally then saw family and friends drowning in the richest country in the world. It was horrific in that aspect. And for me, the inconvenient truth wasn't just the climate crisis. The inconvenient truth was white supremacy, because it literally left poor Black people to die, literally. And I think that was horrific. And I pledged, one of the things I pledged my life to just do whatever for my, people in my community. And I hope that I've done that, but they're really that they have been amazing. There have been so many amazing people you mentioned earlier who passed on, like Mama D, Diane French Cole, who literally would not leave when Hurricane Katrina hit. And when Hurricane Katrina hit in her community, to understand, in the 7th Ward, it was a community that was, these are Black people who worked all their lives for home ownership, to have their home, but they had gone through everything from the back of the bus to Jim Crow, through, lynching. They had gone through everything. Last one hired, first one fired, being spit on, all of that as proud Black people. And so they had a lot of people in her neighborhoods was seniors. Now, she actually, that time, I think, was in her 70s herself, but they people in the 80s and 90s, and they couldn't leave. And so when Hurricane Katrina hit, as an example, the water started to rise. And a lot of these seniors, they literally couldn't get up their steps in many cases to avoid the water, and they drowned. And then when the water began to rise, the water pushed their bodies out. And so Mama D and her son would see the bodies of her neighbors float down the street. And so she would go out there with a rope to tie them to her front tree, because she said, these are my neighbors. But those are the impacts of the climate crisis, that you now have your neighbors floating down the street. She literally would see the wheelchair come down first, and then the grandmother floating down second. And then she would catch him, and then she would tie him to the tree. And then, when they came to put those kind of iconic markings, if you remember this, people remember, they put those markings, because when the National Guard came by, they came to check each house, and they would put a marking, like an X, and they would check how many bodies were either in the house or anything like that. And she didn't put anybody put the markings on her street, Derjewan Street, because he said, we checked our homes because, these are our neighbors. I think that's what people forget about with the climate crisis, that these are our neighbors, right? All this what we're trying to avoid is just that. And so Mama D passed a little while ago, and she fought all the way. But ever since then, I've been fighting, like many others, not just me, but many others been fighting to just bring awareness to what it can be. And it's getting worse, because last year, we had hurricanes that were in the Greek alphabet. I mean, we had so many hurricanes coming to the Gulf Coast. We were using the Greek. We had gone through the entire alphabet. And so people aren't listening to what's happening, and their neighbors are going to be floating down the street if they don't listen.
I think on that subject of, this is happening to neighbors, and neighbors that maybe you don't even realize you had. One of the most heartbreaking, and I might get emotional about it, but one of the most heartbreaking parts of watching the devastation of Katrina for me was watching the Orleans Parish prison be abandoned, and all of those human beings left to drown there in their cells. And I think one of the other unseen aspects of environmental racism, particularly at a time of climate collapse, is that after the storm passed, frankly, refugees in New Orleans were treated like looters when they were fighting for their life.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was, I think, it was something that we have to never forget, but we have to continue to work on. And I'm always just amazed at how much we try to move on. What's interesting about that, and this is, again, there's a real side to the fossil fuel industry that we now know that it was right around that time, because of that heartbreak, those tears that you have for those you heard and saw drown in prisons or in homes. That we also know around that same time is when the climate and the fossil fuel industry begun to use the term about climate denial. They were so afraid of our emotions being real and being in touch with our humanity, they begin to say that that's when you really begin to a peak in the climate denial process around 2006 and 2005. That's how sinister they are in that aspect. And so they begin to use that. And so they kept using that obviously for as long as they could, and just paid for whoever they could pay for to use it. Then obviously now when that's no longer fashionable, they're now moving from climate denial to climate delay, in which now they just want to delay policies that we need to have that can help us stop these crises. Or at best, they want to use what I say climate dilute, which is in essence trying to dilute the policy. So if the policy does get passed, they want to dilute it so much that it really has no bearing at all to have any real teeth. And so that's where we are now. So think about that. When we were going through this, people were drowning. They were so much afraid of losing their profits. They were literally revving up the climate denial aspect to this process. And so I think that's what we have to realize too, is that there is a fossil fuel industry whose business plan means a death sentence for our communities. And listen, that business plan doesn't work for me. I can't have your business plan mean a death sentence for me and my communities. And so we have to work hard to stop that.
Yeah. Why do you think that hip hop is such a good mobilizing tool in this work?
Yeah, well, two reasons. One, I think hip hop is actually created directly from what we're talking about here. I mean, it's actually in line with environmental justice and transportation justice. Hip hop is created in the Bronx. Shout out to the Bronx, the boogie down Bronx, and hip hop was created in which when they began to redline and build the Bronx Causeway and put a highway that divided the community in that process. And when that highway divides the community, then that literally is the beginnings of those young people beginning to speak out. And so, believe it or not, hip hop has a lot of its direct roots to environmental and transportation justice. Shout out Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who was talking about that. I didn't know he had so much hip hop and highway history in him, but that's a shout out to him. And that I heard him the other day on the Breakfast Club, and so that was a great. I mean, he was keeping that. I didn't know that was a connection, but I think that's one thing. But also, I think that using storytelling, right? I think that one thing about the climate movement, they haven't really been good storytellers. Mm-hmm. Great scientists, phenomenal scientists, and great policy makers, terrible storytellers. And so I think that we're realizing that we need to have better storytellers who can tell the story a little better in that aspect. And so I think that's what we're seeing now. And so hip hop is really good at telling stories. And so that's one thing that we bring into the process. I think we able to use our cultural expression to shape our political experience. And I think that if we can do that more, and also I think that hip hop is something that's great because it's also not just, while it's centered in urban and Black and brown and indigenous youth, and obviously has a reach, obviously, as you know, throughout the Pacific and throughout the world, it definitely is something that also is a culture. So it doesn't limit anybody. So you could be white, you could be whoever, you could be from the suburbs, you could be from wherever, and still be a part of the culture. And I think because of that, that helps us to overcome the racial aspect of which holds us back. That, you know, and I think that, so because it's a culture, we can then all kind of like have a level playing ground, so it doesn't get real awkward and real tricky sometimes in our conversation.
Real awkward. That felt. I think that is just key. Hip hop was such a big mobilizing factor for me. I remember Killer Mike's rap music came out when I was 16. You know, I came home, told my dad, "Did you know about Iran-Contra?" It's like, yeah, I did. But it's true. It's such, yeah, heard. I think one of the other aspects, and you mentioned this earlier, but we got a lot of folks dying because of the movement, who are carrying a lot. There's skyrocketing suicide rates in Black and Indigenous youth. And one way that has been shown to restore people is connection to their culture. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the restorative power of hip hop. And
yeah, that's a great question. And I really want to. That's one that hits me hard, because I think that one, as somebody mentioned, we started this conversation with me being mentored, being around the great Dr. Dorothy Irene Height, and so I was able to glean a lot of those learnings. And one of the things I learned also was that you can't do this work if you're bitter, if you're jaded, or you're cynical. You just can't. It'll eat you up. And so for a lot of the activists and even the journalists, if that becomes to overtake you, you can get lost in it, right? You can get lost. It can consume you, and then you're done. And so I think you have to have something to anchor yourself. It could be either a loved one, it could be spirit, it could be beauty, it could be nature, whatever it is. But you have to have something outside of yourself to anchor yourself. And so I think that what we're now seeing is a lot of young people who, I mean, it's hard, right? Because they're not just fighting for equality, they're fighting also for existence. And so that's hard. That's hard. That's a heavy thing when, and then we have a lot of folks who are either in the boomers or even my group, Generation X generation or Generation X, whatever, and even older millennials. I think that they may miss a lot of things, but those who are in, where they now see Gen Z, and even they said, I guess, Gen C for the generation for the coronavirus. It's crazy. But I think that, they're going to be dealing with this when they're in their 50s and 60s and 70s. And so they know that. A lot of them don't want to have children. They're saying that, no, I don't want to have any kids. I don't want to bring any kids into this world. Or they're literally, they're checking out. And I think that, if you feel that way, you got to get help, because we want you around. We really want you. Don't ever feel that, don't ever become overwhelmed. One of the things for me is that, this is, I would say I'm from down south, so this is part of my faith tradition, but they would say down south that, the battle is not yours, it's the Lord's. And I think a lot of times people have to realize that this ain't just their battle. It's a big one. The climate crisis is daunting. And again, when we have folks in the fossil fuel industry whose business plan is a death sentence for us, it seems crazy, but you can't give up. And we've overcome so much together as humans. For me, as a Black person, we've overcome slavery. We've overcome for having women's rights. We have gay rights. We have so many we have so many things that we've come together as humans. This is a hard one. The climate crisis is a hard one, but I just believe that if we all come together, I believe that we can succeed. We have to. And it's a tough time because we have a lot of things going on from police brutality, obviously from the pandemic, from poverty, from pollution. It's daunting, but we can't give up hope.
How do you think that we can become better storytellers? So we don't have good storytelling. I agree.
Yeah, no, we have some. I mean, I tell you, that's one of the things. But one of the good things about the Zoom, the virtual world, that I had to go to some of these rallies, and I can say it now. But my goodness, they would kill me when they would be talking, and I mean, my Lord, say a joke, say something, get us going. I mean, get it. Talk about the cat back home. I mean, my goodness, tell a good story. I mean, I think that some of it's just natural. It's gifts, right? That's why we have to nurture the gifts. Everybody is not going to be the chemist or the scientist or the policymaker. So I think some of it's gifting. We have to nurture those gifts and then support those. I think a lot of that we're seeing now is that we have to then, if we have folks who are telling it through film, either through poetry, support that. And I think that I'm seeing more climate stories being supported in the movement. And I'm excited about that. I know that we've done a few things to try, we've done a few things, the Hip Hop Caucus, through our Think 100% platform, telling stories. But I mean, there's so many who I think are just genius telling the stories that I think we just gotta keep lifting those stories up. And I think that this is something for journalists. I think journalists are storytellers. Your journalists are I mean, you have to be a storyteller to be a journalist. Obviously you won't be a good journalist. So I think that journalists can tell a story. I think so we need them also. They're part of this to tell the story. I'm not asking them to tell it from one side or the other. I'm just telling them to tell the story. Just tell it, because also we have a crisis now where journalists aren't also telling enough of what's going on. So they got to tell the story as well.
Yeah. There's a question about that in the chat that we can get to. And if anybody has questions, a reminder that you can put that in the Q&A. But first, could you tell us a little bit more? I know there's something going on tonight. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'm so excited about tonight. I mean, tonight is man, to me, it's 51 years in the making. It's literally, it's Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities leading on the conversation. We have the We Shall Breathe Earth Day Summit. And I just feel like it's just an amazing situation that we have tonight. Please, I want everybody to join. We can put in the chat. It starts at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is actually, you need to watch it. This is one of the things, you need to kind of just watch it to see this a different way of telling the climate story. Like it is a summit that is so different on how it's brought together. You just got to see it to almost like, oh, I never would have thought that's how the climate conversation could look. Like that's the thing. And clearly it's connected to the times. I mean, right now, I just want to make sure lift up all of those who have been killed. There's a lot of people who are hurting right now. They're on the edge of their seat in regards to the George Floyd trial. They're obviously what happened from Dante Wright to Adam Toledo to Breonna Taylor. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's so much hurt within Indigenous and Black and Brown communities in regards to the policing conversation. So we connect the dots that climate justice is racial justice and racial justice is climate justice. And so tonight you're going to see the groups on the front lines, on the front fence, just having it's amazing. So I encourage everybody to check out weshallbreathe.com tonight, 7 p.m.
Thank you. And there was this great question from Axel Ching. In the Philippines, the government shut down the largest media network, which provides service even in the far-flung areas of the country. When a super typhoon hit the Philippines in the latter part of 2020, many residents from those areas were severely affected or died due to lack of prior information and media coverage. She wants to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so as we approach COP26, which is the world conversation, and that happens in November, and obviously even this coming week with the world leaders who are coming on April 22nd, we're seeing this connection where media and governments are more closely aligned. That's sometimes for good, but also sometimes for bad, because a lot of times then these countries don't want to transition and don't want to be held accountable. So they're cutting down the conversations. And so we're seeing that. Thank you for bringing it up in regards to the Philippines and throughout the Pacific, but also throughout the world, and definitely on the continent of Africa and other places, and definitely in the global South and other places as well. We're seeing this kind of cutting down of both journalists and activists. Shout out to Berta Caceres, who was killed a while ago in Honduras, and many other activists who are being killed around the globe. But even those stories, and then they now are not being told, but then the stories of those who are in harm's way, they're cutting off the mechanism. So this is actually very interesting. I think that this, again, we're going to need courageous journalists at this moment to tell the story, but we're also going to need to make sure that the media companies and media corporations keep the lines of communication, because those are a way as we begin to not only move from the climate crisis, but to climate adaptation and climate resiliency. We're going to need mechanisms to help us to survive, because to some degree, we may be even too far gone. Some things we won't get. I mean, we're hopeful that we can change things in the next 9 years. But if we don't, that we're going to need to have measures to adapt to where we are. And we're going to need to have, strong media operations that will obviously alert people. But they don't want to do that if they know that they're also kind of at the crime scene themselves. So again, this goes back to strong journalism, to tell these stories, to break these things so that we can, as humans, have a fighting chance.
Yeah, one more question. What internal work do you recommend journalists and the public do if they are interested in this work? And how do you stay grounded?
2 questions, actually.
Yeah. Kayla.
So I think that the one thing is that doing the research, again, on the issue of justice in the climate movement, just Googling that. I know I've written a lot about that, so you can just Google that and see all that. But just really just going on there and seeing the connection between environmental justice and climate justice and racial justice. I think just making sure you're doing your research on that beforehand to get an idea of what that is and what it means for the conversation. Simply what it means in some cases is saying that the conversation isn't just ice caps and greenhouse gas, but it's about humanity. And so that's really what we're asking you to do with journalists. Begin to shift your lens from just greenhouse gases and the ice caps melting to the impact of the crisis on humans. That's your lens. So that's your first step. Shift your lens to humans. Seems natural, but it doesn't happen as much. And then for me, staying grounded, I think, it's interesting. It's, we did a comedy special called Ancient Mama's Heat Wave, which we actually that came out.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah. In which, we have to laugh and enjoy. And for me, it's about just staying, never forgetting about that. I may, listen, I will not be here 100 years from now. 100 years from now, most of us on this call will not be here. And that actually is grounding, because you realize that, but what will be here will be what we leave for that next generation. And if they turn around in 21, actually then it'll be 2121. If they look at that time from 100 years from now, and they're here, and they have clean air, and they have clean water, and they are living in a world that they're not fighting literally for water and for air, then we would have succeeded. We'll be part of this planet in some aspect, but we won't be here in our present form. But what will be here will be what we wrote about as journalists, what we fought about as activists, what we prayed about in our prayers. That will be here to keep them alive. And then that keeps me grounded, because even though I won't be here to see it, I know they will live.
Yeah.
But if we fail, then they won't live. And that to me also grounds me, because that is unacceptable and that can't happen.
Well, I've already kept you longer than I said I would. I have enjoyed this so deeply.
Thank you for having me.
Sainama Asi is how we say it in Chamorro. Thank you so much. This has been truly wonderful. I will do some of the closing remarks now, unless you have anything to add.
No, I see y'all tonight at We Shall Breathe.
Yes.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
are so thankful to Reverend Yearwood for today's conversation. A recording will be online at pulitzercenter.org in the coming days, so please feel free to share. Thank you so much to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Francesca Edrelin, who has been our producer for this session. We appreciate our audience for joining us today, and for those who are able, please remember that we are a nonprofit journalism organization, and so we depend on donor support. Please donate today and become a Pulitzer Center champion at any level to gain exclusive benefits as part of our spring campaign. And please check out pulitzercenter.org/events to see additional panels and events during our Environment Redefined conference. Our next event is Rooted in Race and Class, Intersections in Climate Stories, later today at 2 p.m. Eastern. Please stay with us a few minutes longer to take a brief survey after we officially end today's session. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope you'll join us throughout this week.